Hey, I'm Jake, and right now I'm more excited than a virgin at an orgy because today on the Steaming Pile we're talking about 10 celebrity appearances in wrestling. With that being said, let's get started. First up, we have the time that Adam West appeared as Batman on Memphis Wrestling. He was being interviewed by Dave Brown, and during the course of the interview, he would be interrupted by Jerry the King Lawler. Lawler, a heel at the time, confronted Adam West, who was dressed as Batman, yes, Batman, but only in the cowl, because he didn't want to wear the whole Batman costume as it was hot and uncomfortable at the time, so he wore the cowl and a tracksuit. Was interrupted by Jerry the King Lawler wearing a Superman parody suit, where in place of the S where the crest / shield would be on the costume, it was a crown. Jerry Lawler cuts a promo on Adam West Batman and calls the fans rednecks, this, that, and the other, typical wrestling fare. Adam West responds in kind in Batman parlance and says that he believes that Jerry the King Lawler can be reformed if he changes his ways in the ring and uses his left and right turning indicators. In an interview / promo that really went nowhere and only served to just bolster the prestige, I guess, of Memphis wrestling. But what makes this interview so great is the fact that several people theorize that Adam West was drunk. And you can tell when you see the video, link in the description, as Adam West just seems to be off his game. He seems to be slurring his speech a tad and just not completely there. Now, Dave Brown swears that Adam West had had nothing to drink and that it can be chalked up to the fact that Adam West had not actively been Batman for about 10 years at this point. That show was shot in the 60s, and I believe this interview occurred sometime in the 70s. Now, bonus fact here. Besides this Adam West confrontation and the Andy Kaufman feud that we covered in a previous video, this was not the first or last time a celebrity would be involved in Memphis wrestling. Well, what I'm going to go into now is something that almost happened and could have been great. One thing we almost got was Jerry the King Lawler versus Elvis Presley. It was going to be the Battle of the Kings. Who's the true king of Memphis? Jerry Lawler had worked it out with Elvis's management that after Elvis wrapped up his current tour, that the King would work a match with the King of Rock and Roll, Elvis Presley, as Elvis was a huge wrestling fan. And he thought that this would just be a fun thing to do. Tragically though, before we got this, Elvis would die while on tour, supposedly on a toilet, or abducted by aliens if you believe conspiracy theories. But I just like to imagine what almost was. We could have had Elvis versus Jerry the King Lawler. The battle of words, the promos leading up to this would have been fan-fucking-tastic. And I can only imagine, since Elvis supposedly knew karate, that would have been worked into the match at some point. So you would have had King doing Southern wrestling brawling style versus Elvis Presley, who would probably match him in the brawling until King got the better of him. Then you've got Elvis busting out, look out, man, I'm the king, busting roundhouses, sidekicks, karate chops, palm strikes. It just would have been a freak show, and I'm sad we didn't get to see it. That being said, let's move on. Number 2, we're going to talk about RoboCop and 1990s Capital Combat put on by WCW, operating under the NWA banner at the time. It was a weird period. WCW, NWA, they were synonymous. But WCW partnered heavily with the studio that was releasing the sequel to RoboCop, RoboCop 2. There's a ridiculous promo that was shot with classic Sting. I'm talking about pink tights, neon face paint, bleach blonde crew cut Sting, and RoboCop for Capital Combat. But what we're going into is the culmination of the pay-per-view. Sting goes down to confront Flair or some sort of nonsense, is trapped by the Four Horsemen, and not even the good Four Horsemen, the Sid Vicious Four Horsemen, which consisted of Ole and Arn Anderson. Granted, Ole and Arn, great members of the Four Horsemen, but no one gave a crap about Psycho Sid and the Four Horsemen, who are, Flair stooges at the time. Sting is locked in probably the fakest looking cage ever. I mean, it looks like it's made out of licorice or cardboard. It's ridiculous. He is quote unquote locked in a cage. RoboCop then again, this is the culmination of the pay-per-view. The main event has already transpired. RoboCop then slowly limps to the ring like a snail on ketamine, proceeds to go over to the cage, rip the door off, and then Sting and RoboCop proceed to run off 3 out of the 4 of the 4 horsemen. It's ridiculous, and the best thing about it, again, link in the description, the best thing about it is hearing Jim Ross, or good old JR, who is one of the commentators for WCW at the time, trying to sell this. Like, he is 100% doing his job, and he makes this seem like this is a serious, awesome situation, but he's got to be dying inside. I would almost guarantee you that Jim Ross would rather have a colonoscopy than be calling this bullshit right here. It has to be seen to be believed. Anyway, third up we have Drew Carey competing in the Royal Rumble. I think this was the 2001 Royal Rumble. Don't pin me down on that. I'm not too sure. Drew Carey, early in the night, or at some point, was convinced by Vince McMahon to compete in the Royal Rumble. They shoot an angle where it looks like he enters the Royal Rumble to try to impress Trish Stratus. It's pretty ridiculous. But Drew actually has a fairly decent performance, as he's able to eliminate the Hardys, who are fighting in the corner. I can't remember who's on top of who, Matt or Jeff, who's getting the better of whom. But Drew walks over to the corner, is able to push them off, eliminating them both, making Drew Carey the only man standing in the Royal Rumble at the time. The next opponent to come out is the Big Red Machine, the Demon Kane. Kane makes an overlong entrance, which isn't really out of the ordinary for Kane. That's typical Kane, but this time it seems like it's taken just a little bit longer, and I would guarantee that that's to buy time for Drew Carey. It takes Kane almost the entirety of the 2 minutes to get into the ring, as 2 minutes are what usually pass between Royal Rumble entrances. Kane makes his way into the ring. Drew Carey looks like he's about to shit himself. He's hollering at referees. He's making a meal of this. He's doing actually a really good job for someone who doesn't wrestle. Kane gets nose to nose with Drew Carey, or chest to nose, because Kane towers over Drew Carey. Drew Carey starts throwing money at him, trying to beg off Kane. And again, Kane's basically eating up all the time with his entrance. So just a few seconds in, it looks like Kane is getting ready to chokeslam Drew Carey, but all of a sudden, Raven makes his way in and starts beating Kane with a foreign object. Drew then eliminates himself, and Kane and Raven start to duke it out. The Royal Rumble goes forward as normal. Now we come to Jon Stewart, costing John Cena the WWE Championship at SummerSlam 2015. Now, Jon Stewart is an avid pro wrestling fan. Occasionally, he would throw out references to WWE and wrestling during The Daily Show when he hosted it, especially the later years. An angle was even shot where Seth Rollins came onto The Daily Show and said some things about Jon Stewart, but this was after Jon Stewart had said some things about Seth Rollins on The Daily Show. This led to sort of a thing that bled into SummerSlam 2015. However, during the match, even though you would think that Jon Stewart would want John Cena to win, as he had had issues with Seth Rollins, he comes in and, I don't want to say blasts John Cena with a chair to cost him the title, but he comes in, delivers a chair shot, gets Cena disqualified. I believe that's the way it went. I don't think he hit Rollins. But this left fans shocked. So the next night, on Raw, he goes to explain his actions. At this time, John Cena had been wrestling for what would have been his 16th title win at the time. That would have made him tie Ric Flair for all-time world championships. John Cena cuts a promo basically stating that this is the reason he did what he did. He did not want John Cena to tie Ric Flair. This leads to a whole thing. We've got the link in the description to that. However, it's too bad that Jon Stewart wasn't around for the Royal Rumble 2017, where John Cena faced AJ Styles for the title and won, thus tying Ric Flair for most championships won. At this point, John Cena has not won his 17th title, surpassing Ric Flair, but he's still got a few years. Once he's done with Hollywood, I'm sure they're going to give him the belt. Moving on. Let's talk about Stephen Amell. I don't really want to talk about Stephen Amell because I fucking hate Arrow. I hate Arrow because I love Green Arrow. And I find Arrow, the show, to be a poor representation of Green Arrow as a character. But we're not here to talk about that. We're here to talk about Stephen Amell getting involved with wrestling. That's right. Stephen Amell, real-life friends with Cody Rhodes, who at the time was wrestling as Stardust. Cody Rhodes is the brother of Dustin Rhodes, or Goldust. Now, they started a sort of Twitter feud that lasted for a while and culminated in a match in which Stardust, King Barrett, would tag against Stephen Amell and Neville, formerly known and currently known as Pac. The match was fairly decent. There were some criticisms levied by industry insiders. Stone Cold was fairly critical of the match, but it was definitely a serviceable match. Now, this is the only time Stephen Amell would step inside the ring. Later, during the pay-per-view, which was sort of the proto pay-per-view for the current wrestling company AEW, All In, Stephen Amell would have a match with Christopher Daniels. And this was a way better match than the one he had had in WWE. After that, Stephen Amell would say that this would be his last outing in wrestling. But you know what they say never in wrestling. Although, please God, never again. Alright, next we have Cyndi Lauper. Cyndi Lauper made several wrestling appearances. We're not even going to cover them all. It was part of what was termed the Rock and Wrestling Connection, although more accurately it probably should have been called the Pop and Wrestling Connection. Cyndi Lauper befriended Captain Lou Albano. I believe this was outside of wrestling. She even put Lou Albano in her music video, Girls Just Want to Have Fun, I believe it was. She would make an appearance on Piper's Pit, an interview segment that was recurring on WWF at the time, hosted by Rowdy Roddy Piper. During this, a dispute would break out between her and Captain Lou Albano. Albano would take credit for the popularity of her music video, blah, blah, blah. It would eventually lead to a match. Now, however, Lou Albano, being retired from wrestling at this point and only a wrestling manager, and Cyndi Lauper not being a wrestling performer, would need surrogates to battle it out. So Lou Albano would take a not too ancient at the time, Fabulous Moolah, as his representative, and Cyndi Lauper would take Wendy Richter as her representative. And Wendy Richter at the time was a trailblazer for women's wrestling in the United States. There would be a match. Wendy would go over and beat Fabulous Moolah. Eventually the hatchet would be buried between Lauper and Albano, and Cyndi Lauper would even appear at the first WrestleMania. With that being said, love Cyndi Lauper's music, hate Cyndi Lauper's music, it doesn't really matter. She was very important to wrestling. The celebrity power that she added to WrestleMania 1 can't be understated. And also, who doesn't love Captain Lou Albano? The guy was fucking Mario in the cartoon series. He voiced him and he was the creepy live-action Mario. Another bonus fact for you all. Next we've got Alice fucking Cooper at WrestleMania 3. That's right. Alice Cooper would accompany Jake the Snake during WrestleMania 3 down to the ring. There would be an interview segment with Gene Okerlund interviewing Alice Cooper and Jake the Snake Roberts that would play before the match, in which Jake the Snake Roberts would wrestle the Honky Tonk Man, who was being managed by Mouth of the South, Jimmy Hart, at the time. Alice was down there to keep Jimmy in check, and, Jake was there to beat the shit out of the Honky Tonk Man. Typical wrestling hijinks would ensue, and Jimmy Hart would cost Jake the match, and Honky Tonk Man would win. Now, however, Alice Cooper and Jake would get their revenge by grabbing Jimmy Hart and menacing him with Jake's snake, Damien. Eventually, Honky Tonk Man would return, pull Jimmy out of the ring, and they would hightail it out of there. Next up, we've got the Insane Clown Posse. Don't turn off the channel. It's interesting, I swear. The Insane Clown Posse were huge wrestling fans. They would make their WWF debut with a group called the Oddities. Now, granted, they were more like celebrity buddies of the Oddities in WWF. They functioned sort of as mascots and managers. The Oddities were a group of wrestlers that were kind of billed as circus freaks, with Kurgan, I believe, being the only one that really stood out at the time. I don't quite remember who all was in the Oddities. It's just notable that ICP was in there. ICP didn't have much ring time at this point, but they did, however, have a tag team match against the Headbangers. ICP's stint in WWF was very short-lived. However, they would go on to wrestle in WCW, where they had several one-offs and a lot more ring time than they ever got in WWF. And this even wouldn't be the Insane Clown Posse's last foray into wrestling. They've even made appearances in TNA, and they started their own wrestling company at one point called JCW, Juggalo Championship Wrestling. And you may think that this is just a stupid, dumb vanity project, and you'd only be half right. Like, it is kind of a stupid, dumb vanity project, but they've had fairly big names wrestle for them. They've had Abdullah the Butcher, they've had Raven, they've had Vampiro, they've had King Kong Bundy, and we've included the King Kong Bundy match in the links in the description because the commentary, it's the Insane Clown Posse going back over the match and doing commentary, and it's nothing but jokes about how King Kong Bundy looks like a human penis. Totally worth a watch. Now, don't get me wrong, most of the big name wrestlers that they've had, even Scott Hall, forgot to mention him, most of the big time wrestlers they've had wrestle for them in JCW were well beyond their prime at the time that they wrestled for them. But even at the Gathering of the Juggalos, they still put on wrestling events and draw out big names to wrestle for them. X-Pac has made Gathering appearances, Mick Foley has done comedy and commentary at the Gathering, and I believe Jerry Lawler and Terry Funk within the last few years past have had a match at the Gathering of the Juggalos. So say what you will about the Insane Clown Posse and their music, but they are actually tremendous wrestling fans. And that brings us to David Arquette and back to WCW. Now, for those of you who don't remember, David Arquette started a movie called Ready to Rumble. Ready to Rumble was about two wrestling fans who thought wrestling was 100% legit. Like, the outcomes weren't predetermined, it was just a pure sport. And they want to get their favorite wrestler, a disgraced Jimmy the King, played by Oliver Platt, who was fired from WCW, back in the game in wrestling. But we're not here to talk about the movie, we're here to talk about David Arquette. The movie actually featured WCW wrestlers like Macho Man Randy Savage, Diamond Dallas Page, Goldberg, and so on and so forth. However, to help promote the movie, Arquette would appear on WCW programming and in some WCW storylines. In fact, at one point, David Arquette would be in a WCW title match, which featured Diamond Dallas Page, Jeff Jarrett, and I can't remember the other participant, and David Arquette. David Arquette would win in controversial fashion, as it was a four-way and two people were pinned. Jarrett had a wrestler pinned and Arquette had a wrestler pinned. I don't know who was on DDP at the time. But a ref would come in and count the 1, 2, 3, Arquette's cover, and David Arquette would be WCW champion. This is a huge controversy in wrestling fandom, as the joke would be, for years, something to the effect that putting the strap on David Arquette killed WCW, or that's a worse idea than putting the belt on David Arquette, just so on and so forth. Now, David Arquette legitimately was a wrestling fan. He loved pro wrestling. He actually did not want the belt, and he thought it was just as stupid of an idea as the fans thought. But apparently this has bothered Arquette for years, because he was tired of being the butt of all of these pro wrestling jokes. Not so much for the fact that he was ashamed of being involved in wrestling or anything of that nature, but because he felt he had done wrestling a disservice, and he wanted to rectify that. So, over a decade later, within the last 2 to 3 years, David Arquette has actually gone on and trained as a professional wrestler and is currently wrestling around the nation on the indie circuit. We've thrown a link in the description for one of his matches. I believe it was his first professional match since actually being trained as a wrestler from Championship Wrestling from Hollywood. Now, it's not the best wrestling match in the world, but it was his first legit wrestling match. I mean, as legit as a predetermined form of entertainment can be. And it was pretty good, and he's only getting better. Honestly, no bullshit, my hat's off to him for doing it. Check David Arquette's matches out if you get the chance. Alright. Lastly, we come to Donald Trump. Donald Trump, believe it or not, the current president of the United States, has a pretty long history with professional wrestling. Trump Plaza hosted WrestleMania 4 and WrestleMania 5. And if I'm remembering right, one of those is the WrestleMania where Macho Man Randy Savage won the WWF title. So that's awesome in and of itself. Now, we're not here to talk about politics. Just think of Trump as a guy who appeared in wrestling. I don't really give a shit about the politics right now. I give a shit about the hilarity of it all. So, yes, he hosted WrestleMania 4 and 5. But the most notable appearance for Donald Trump in a pro wrestling ring has to do with the Battle of the Billionaires at WrestleMania 23. After a guest host Raw appearance, a feud would begin with Vince McMahon between Donald Trump and Vince, where a storyline would be something to the effect of Trump bought WWE Raw or some sort of nonsense, and it was just on and off screen a dick measuring contest about who had the most money, to be quite honest with you. And some of the moments were pretty funny, and it was pretty good, but this would all end with a match at WrestleMania. Now, granted, McMahon and Trump would not wrestle each other in the Battle of the Billionaires. They would have representatives, with Donald Trump picking Bobby Lashley as his representative, and Vince McMahon picking Umaga as his representative. Now, the whole deal was that whoever's wrestler won would get to shave the head of the other person. We all know about Donald Trump's hair and all the jokes and how he probably wears a wig and how it's fake. But what some of you may not know is some people say the same thing about Vince McMahon. So either way, we were going to get a head shaving. And it was just a pretty fun, stupid, ridiculous premise. Now, on top of this, Stone Cold Steve Austin was the guest enforcer, which means if the referee was not fulfilling his duties, Stone Cold would slide in, count the 3, and take over as referee. And he was also there to make sure that the rules were followed and there was no bullshit. So that would of course happen. Lashley would pin Umaga, which gave Trump the victory. Stone Cold would then help restrain Vince McMahon while Donald Trump and Bobby Lashley, along with Stone Cold, shaved Vince's head. But that's not why I brought this up. The best part about all this is during the celebration, Stone Cold is drinking beer in the corner, Donald Trump is doing the same. But during the celebration, Stone Cold would get down off of the corner and give a Stone Cold Stunner to Donald Trump. That's right, Stone Cold Steve Austin fucking gave a stunner to the future president of the United States. So really, this was just a backdoor way for me to talk about how fucking awesome Stone Cold is. This is the only professional wrestler who gave his finisher to a future president. The sitting president of the United States of America was given a Stone Cold Stunner. There is no other wrestler in the history of wrestling who has given a stunner to a president, past, present, or future, at the moment. And to me, that's just awesome. Nothing's more American than the Stone Cold Stunner. Anyway, that's it for this week's video. Don't forget to hit that like and subscribe button. And that's the bottom line, 'cause Stone Cold said so. See y'all. That honky man. Shit, nah. It's but fucking stupid.